Hello, my name is Kai, and I am a bit of a rambler. I like to travel, learn, and tell stories. And recently I stopped by the US, and I was asked a similar question that I've received many times, but how is the quality of life in third world countries? And I say, oh, it's pretty bad. Like, you can get shot for expressing your political opinion. You might have gangs, anonymous gangs going around the streets, grabbing, kidnapping, and executing people extrajudicially. There's no due process. There's no arraignment of any kind. They just go around doing whatever they want. In fact, in third world countries, police officers can be legally completely above the law, like as ordered by the court. They're just allowed to do whatever they want. Take the private property of citizens or execute citizens extrajudicially. You might not have access to a free press that's untouched by political idealism, so you can have zealots who own newspapers and refuse to let their journalists publish stories that the journalists find important just because of the political ideals of the owner or editor of the newspaper. Many people in third world countries can't apply for certain jobs or certain economic opportunities that should be available to them, but because of how their society is constructed, they did not have access to education. They can't afford groceries. Maybe they hurt themselves and did not have access to healthcare, so they never recovered. And so they can't work in how they were trained to work or how they know how to work. They might not have any reliable transportation in their country, so if there is an economic opportunity, they can't get to it anyway, so they could be completely qualified for a job that would improve their lives, but because their country doesn't provide their citizens with reasonable access to travel, a lot of the citizens are sort of trapped and stuck where they were born or where they circumstantially ended up in, because it's so difficult to move from one place to the next. The cost of living can be prohibitively expensive in third world countries. Most citizens in third world countries have given up on ever getting a home for themselves. It's just practically out of their reach, financially out of their reach, to get a house or to own property, because most of the property is owned by the people who set the rates of how much it costs to buy a house. With wages having stagnated for a generation and a half, for about 50 years, there's really very little practical pathways, very few practical pathways for people in third world countries to own property or buy a home or even purchase a vehicle a lot of the time. And it's usually around this time that the person I'm talking to, who's been like, oh my God, that sounds terrible, realizes, because of the enormous housing crisis in their own country, that I am referring to the United States. But usually when US people ask me about third world countries, they mean poor countries. And I know that because the other thing I say, that's usually how I respond to someone like who's listening and we're like just halfway into a conversation. They're like, hey, like, are third world countries as bad as they say? And then I'll sort of have a little fun with that speech. Never meanly, and I explain exactly what I'm talking about when they're like, wait, you mean the US? And I'm like, yeah. Because if you're asking about third world countries using that phrase, you're probably just asking about poor countries. But many poor countries have a higher quality of life than life in the United States. The thing about the phrase third world country is that there's no strict definition of what a third world country is, except not aligned with NATO or the Warsaw Pact, like historically. So that's most of the world, 150 countries that weren't aligned with either pact. And because they didn't have a lot of money, and so they weren't considered a valuable ally to either the members of NATO or the members of the Warsaw Pact, the so-called First World and Second World, respectively. Third World is kind of associated with poor, especially today, but it's more absurd than ever, especially today, when you can go to most countries, and by that I mean there are 200 countries, and most of them, the majority, have flat screen TVs and computers and smartphones, and not even most, all of them have smartphones, but that's how NATO was referred to. NATO was the first world because they were the most powerful, and so they got to call themselves the first world. They were like, those Warsaw guys, those are all the second world. And so the Soviet Union, Cuba, Vietnam, anyone that was not part of the NATO but had enough resources to be a political world player became part of the second world, especially those part of the Warsaw Pact. And then for the other 150 countries, they were like, and whatever. And they didn't even talk about them. So the 150 countries that weren't deemed valuable enough by either the NATO or Warsaw Pact were referred to as third world countries. Most of those were developing nations, as in non-wealthy nations without the resources to already be industrially developed and have a ton of capital. And that was 3/4 of the countries in the world. The most countries in the world were third world when the term was invented, like 75 years ago in the 1950s. So there's nothing that 3/4 of a century, third world was developed as a really way to dismiss and group together the majority of the world's countries, because all the newspapers wanted to talk about were the more powerful countries, the more influential, politically influential countries. So I do get the question, what are third world countries really like? But then when I describe the earlier examples of how I would consider a third world country as a pejorative term to describe a country without civil liberties or economic opportunity for its citizens, and they realize I'm talking about the United States, I'll often get a little pushback like, well, the United States is a first world country. But the people that know how long I've been traveling will ask something like, wait, is the US a third world country? Or what do you mean the United States is a third world country? This is often accompanied by, we have so much money. But it's for the exact reasons that I mentioned up top, that if we're going to use the phrase third world country at all, which is silly, it's like calling a jokester at the bar, look at that harlequin. It's just this archaic term that doesn't apply to the modern world. It's important to define terms that are still popular, like the third world, as archaic as they may be, so that we can see how ridiculous and outdated they really are. So if it's my first time talking to someone about this and they mention the term third world, I will casually ask, well, what do you mean by third world? And usually I get, well, like, not developed, like not a lot of resources. They're just trying to say poor without saying poor because it does sound denigrative. It's really interesting because I don't think most people that I talk to have ever had that question asked. They know the phrase third world country, and they use it to mean the poor, non-industrialized countries. But I don't think there's anyone I've ever talked to in real life who I've said, well, what do you mean by third country? Who already knew what they meant when they said the phrase third world country about places. I didn't. I used that phrase incorrectly the exact same way most of my life. And then when I point out the complete lack of affordability, the threat of political and cultural violence in the US just for expressing yourself, the age of consent, which is 13 years old in a lot of US states, just a lot of things that you wouldn't think of that apply to a country many people think of as the example, the paragon of the first world, the United States. But there's a lot of things that certainly don't fit the bill once they think about, well, what would a first world citizen be entitled to? Safety in their own country and community, access to higher education, economic opportunity, freedom of speech, civil liberties is usually right up top, like they have rights as citizens. And a lot of people will even say, yeah, but the US has those. And some people in the US have some of those, but many people do not have those. And it's not a new thing. It's not when ICE started shooting US citizens in the street that they lost all of these rights. Everything before 1940, you can kind of just be like, that was basically the medieval times with modern clothing, like after 1900 for a generation and a half or so. But black people couldn't vote. Women couldn't vote 40 years before that, 1920, nationally. The Japanese internment camps then happened during World War II. Full US citizens who had been here for whatever how long were rounded up and put in internment camps because they looked like members of an opposing military. So civil liberties there weren't national civil liberties in the United States that citizens could rely on until, at least the civil rights movement. Like those Japanese internment camps, those were not from people who came from Japan. Those were second or more generations, most of them. There were 120-something thousand interred US citizens. Over 80,000 of those, more than 2/3, were second generation, were dyed in the wool, born in part of the United States. Full citizens, no question at all, documents everything. Most of them, like the vast majority of the interred US citizens, were full US citizens. They're of second or more generations. And this is recent. This is the 1940s that this happened. Your grandparents could have heard this edict on the radio, the same way that you're hearing about ICE shooting people in the street or kidnapping US citizens and taking them away without any due process. It's just the state of civil liberties in the US. And things have not been steadily getting better in terms of civil liberties in the US. Minorities, ethnic and sexual minorities, have had to fight for progress, and there are a couple landmark acts like the Civil Rights Act that guaranteed certain rights for those minorities, but it doesn't mean that there was steady progress moving up and then the Civil Rights Act happened because it was time for everybody to have rights. Like, there wasn't an increase in representation of black congressmen in the United States steadily going up until the Civil Rights Act, and then everything was balanced. There's still an overabundance of white males in United States government, because those are the only people who are allowed to be represented in United States government legally and culturally since its founding, and that only changed 2 generations ago, roughly. About 60 years ago. That's when it became more difficult to stop women and people of color from joining into the mainstream political process of the United States. And 60 years ago is extremely recent. Historically and politically, 60 years is a tick of the second hand. So all of this progress that many of us grew up with, that we think defined the United States and its founding ideals, are extremely recent and only happened because there was a century of campaigning after the end of the Civil War by those minorities to get some degree of political voice in the country. And it's still not much. And then 60 years after what is considered the landmark act, those people of color are being shot or rounded up in the streets and extrajudicially arrested or detained or deported because US citizens are not afforded the civil rights written in the Constitution of the United States. And people living on U.S. soil who are not yet U.S. citizens, but could be 10 years into the process. Some people are getting their citizenship canceled on the day. So they've gone through the entire process for a decade or more, and they're finally going to become a citizen. And then on the day of their citizenship, they've passed all the tests. They have enough money, they have a stable job, they have a support system in the US. They answered all the political questions correctly. They went through all the interviews over a decade. And then they show up to receive their citizenship certificate and take their oath. And they are rounded up by ICE and kicked out of the country for being a quote-unquote illegal alien. And this is happening to full US citizens also. But it doesn't matter if you're going through the correct bureaucratic channels and following the administration's guidelines in the US, because the civil rights of US citizens have been so weakened by judicial revision and based on original, very lacking, vague civil rights from the beginning of the country, but especially by specific judicial revision, Supreme Court decisions that consistently have weakened civil rights in America since the Supreme Court started. Shout out to the 5-4 podcast, by the way. And not just the Supreme Court, but all lower level courts have also ruled against equal civil rights for all American citizens and residents. There's just no tradition of US American national civil liberties or citizen rights as most people think of them. The illusion that there was is largely manufactured by our media and the stories that the US government wants its citizens to think of it as a magnanimous, beneficent government that treats its citizens equally because each citizen earned it and the opportunity is available to all. But that isn't how civil rights developed in the country, and it's the reason now why civil rights are at such a low point that law enforcement officers are able to kill US citizens without any due process. In public, in the street. So I don't usually go full bore when I'm asked that question, like, well, we have a lot of civil rights here. But I mentioned one or two of those examples. I might mention the Japanese internment camp, or that Civil Rights Act only started in 1965, or these days I'm just like, well, they're shooting people in the street now. And the anonymous police officers are killing citizens in the street in the US. And one of those is usually just enough to okay, yeah, I guess we don't exactly have ironclad civil rights in the US as US citizens. But it's not just about civil rights and the intangible free will of the citizens. The more obvious salient aspect is tangible, material. So they'll ask about, well, what about economy? Because we do have the strongest economy in the world. And my immediate response is, what does that get you? It's sure Tesla or Apple are worth $1 trillion, but how does that help strengthen the country or improve the lives of US citizens? And the answer is that it doesn't. It helps a couple people be very wealthy, but it doesn't help any US citizens normal. It doesn't help the 350 million actual US citizens who aren't the owner of Tesla or the owner of Amazon or Apple. That doesn't materially benefit them at all. Those companies are often way underpaying or paying zero taxes per year. And that they're giving nothing back to the community or countries that made them as wealthy as they are. So US citizens are not benefiting from being the richest country in the world, if they still are. They don't even get tangible material advantages that the rest of the world doesn't get. The same houses, the same quality, or better, are to be found around the world. In Africa, in Asia, in Eastern Europe, everywhere. You can get cheaper, better housing. You can own it if you want to, but you can also just travel abroad and access that housing at an incredibly reasonable price. About between $300 to $400 US equivalent in most of the world. In all of those third world countries. But those third world countries' housing are the equivalent or better of US housing. But what about high technology? The US, is so far ahead in terms of high technology. I mean, certainly not anymore. They may have been, they were the first to develop the atomic bomb. That's correct. They were like a little bit ahead. They were like a couple years ahead of people when they went to the moon, and they were a couple years ahead of other countries when the most dangerous weapon in the world. So there were a couple milestones, but I mean, it's important to note that the Soviet Union put the first person into space. And I want to make it very clear here that I am not a bigger fan of the Russian or Chinese government than I am of the US government. But it's important to note that these ideas we have of superiority, of US superiority, are largely stories. Like, by what technological advantage did we have? Space, the Soviet Union put a human into space before the US did. The US made it to the moon first, which is a huge achievement, but they were behind. They lost the space race, getting a human into space, and the thing they achieved was achieved by other countries shortly after. The atomic bomb, many people think the other countries were months behind developing a viable atomic bomb, which they didn't. The US got there first. But I don't know, that's the biggest, most dangerous weapon in human history anyway, so I don't give major props to them for developing that anyway. It's fortunate the US developed it before the Reich did, that's certain. But they were right on their heels, so you would have just had what we have now, mutually assured destruction anyway, and the Soviet Union. But that doesn't really translate to material advantages that US citizens have because of so-called high technology. You go a couple generations later, you go into the 2020s, and everyone has the same material advantages that the US has. Now, yes, not everyone, but most countries in the world, more than half of the 200 countries in the world, have the same housing. They have the exact same smartphones that US people are using. They have the same computers that US citizens use. They have AC in the summer, heating in the winter, hot showers, cold refrigerators. These are not exclusive or unique technologies to so-called first world countries. They have better electric cars than US citizens. And that's where the US has fallen behind and is likely not going to catch up. Because high technology is very dependent on constant innovation and funding and maintenance of research and development. And with 2 non-consecutive terms of President Trump, who actively disbelieves in scientific conclusions and the value of scientific and technological innovation, to the point that federally funded scientists are not allowed to use words like status, which is a fundamental word in like almost so many scientific research papers. You can't use the word gender if you're writing a scientific federally funded article, if you're conducting a federally funded experiment. Gender it's not just a US American term for male, female, or other. It describes seeds. So agricultural science cannot talk about the gender of the seeds, which they need to propagate main crops, all crops. because the plant parts have different genders to reproduce. So there are no federally funded agricultural science experiments or articles. We're not making any progress right now because not making nearly as much as we would be making because federally funded agricultural science, particle science, microchip, everything. You can't use hundreds of very common scientific words that are apolitical, but you're not allowed to use those words in federally funded papers anymore. So federally funded paper for research and technological innovation is dried up and withered away. It's gone. It stopped from 2016 to 2020, and then it really stopped after the second term in 2025 began. That's when this list of terms that you simply cannot do science without were prohibited from federally funded science. Now that's pretty bad, but it doesn't mean that the US has lost 8 years of science. It means that they've lost a generation of scientists who were going to come into the US during one of those two terms. Because if you want to go to the US, but then you find out that you literally are disallowed by the federal government from writing scientific articles or doing scientific research, you will go to a different country that will pay you to do research for them. And China is paying a lot. They want as much technological innovation because they know during that first term and second term, they can close the gap and surpass US technological advantages. And while with the money the US spends on its military budget, it is very likely that they're still ahead in certain critical military areas. On the ground, for citizens, there's no reason for the first world to imagine they have any advantages over the second or third world countries. Microchips, the thing behind every single electronic device we use these days. Taiwan is way ahead of everyone, but especially the US in that field. There's nobody close to Taiwan in the construction and manufacture of high-end next generation microchips. And China has thrown a ton of money into getting close, and they publish articles all the time saying they'll catch up with Taiwan soon, but there's no evidence of them actually catching up with Taiwan soon in terms of next generation microchips. But China has pretty much caught up to the US. The US cannot produce in nearly a percentage point of the quantity of high quality microchips China can produce. And the US does not have next generation chips like Taiwan can produce. So they've lost that already. I mean, everyone lost to Taiwan. Taiwan, TSMC killed the microchip business. They established themselves and nobody has dethroned them since. But the US had a slight advantage, a significant advantage over China in terms of other high-end microchips. Basically, they were a firm second place. But with all of the money that China has poured into microchip manufacture, new plants, new R&D scientists, and especially with the science and technological innovation disallowed and defunded by the 2 non-consecutive Trump terms, that gap has closed. China can produce as many high-end microchips as it wants. And during the Trump administration, high-end chips were approved to be sold to China directly. It's crucial to understand that whatever technological advantage, just like the civil rights advantage US citizens might think they have over other countries, is basically vapor. It's not really there. It was there at some point in history in some way, but today you can go to most countries in the world and people have AC. They have flat screen televisions. They're all using smartphones. Their payment systems are often ahead of the US because they skipped cards, debit cards and credit cards, and they skipped manual financial infrastructure. So now they just basically use QR codes and can instantly scan things. Payment is instant. You can pay off your credit card balance instantly. You don't have to wait 5 days or whatever the US financial infrastructure takes. And they're using the newest iPhone. They're using Motorola's and Samsung's and whatever else US citizens are using. So there's no functional difference in most of the world technology-wise anymore, especially for the base citizens. There are still military and obviously AI applications that, yeah, I'm sure there's just like the space race, they're struggling to see who comes out on top. But materially, quality of life, entertainment-wise, and in practical terms, the technology in what US Americans think of as the third world country is the same or better than US citizens are enjoying, especially in Asia. If you're in Asia, then you have access to better, cheaper technology than US citizens, because China has manufactured everything. They were made into the factory of the world, and then they realized, wait a minute, then we have everything the so-called first world has. And they do. Now they do. They have, like I said, ACs and smartphones and smart TVs and indoor plumbing and hot water and modern materials, alloys to construct their houses with. They build road construction equipment, so their highways are as advanced as US highways. Technology is an important point to bring up because US Americans are very proud of their technology and their perceived technological advantage over third world countries and second world countries and everyone not the US, really. But that's a complete fabrication. The technological superiority of the US, especially of late, is a myth running on legacy ideals, not in any way founded in reality. We don't actually have Tony Stark. We don't have a technology that's so far ahead of everybody else. We're critically behind in most advanced next generation technologies. And I'm specifically referring to electric vehicles, which in comparison to combustion vehicles, are much more scalable and improvable. We can improve a combustion car just so much. In the 100 years since, the Model T was invented, like when combustion cars became the standard of the world because they killed the electric car that Ford made, there have been modest improvements and significant improvements in some ways to engines and the efficiency of combusting gasoline into an explosion, which pushes your pistons and makes your engine work and your car move forward. They've improved a bit. They've basically, in 100 years, doubled the maximum range per gallon of gasoline and made exhaust more efficient and cleaner, stuff like that. But with an electric car, the further technology develops in general, the technological leaps for an electric car are going to completely outpace what combustion cars were able to do in 100. Probably already have since mainstream cars became popular a decade and a half ago, in 15 years. In 15 years since electric vehicles became mainstream, the longest mainstream range one was the Roadster. 15 years ago, could go 240 miles on a charge, stated, but I think there were a lot of problems with that number. And now their cars 15 years later can go double that amount, 500. There are plenty of companies now saying that they're working on or have a prototype of a car that can go 1,000 miles, just a few years later. And that's with conventional battery technology and conventional energy storage technology, which is already, outside of the US, being completely supplanted by next generation power grid storage and, battery technology. So Tesla may have mass marketed the first electric car, but they are way behind in manufacturing. They're way behind in safety and build quality of electric vehicles now, compared to Chinese EV factories. because there aren't many critically complex components that go into making an electric vehicle. You need an electric motor, which is very clean and simple for China, especially to manufacture, and connect it to 2 wheels. And then that's your vehicle. That's all you need. You don't need degradable gasoline lines. You don't need nearly as much lubrication for complex parts. You don't need the engine. And now you can buy a new electric vehicle in China, like the very nice consumer models. Like, I would say not the top of the line, because they have like $1 million ones you can buy if you're obscenely rich and want to show off. But if you're like a top businessman in Beijing and you're not crazy rich, but you're like, I'm going to buy a nice new electric SUV for my family, you can buy one that goes 300 miles on a charge for less than $8,000 new, off the assembly line, delivered to your house. And it has AC and it has seat warmers. It's rated the highest in the world in build quality and safety. Those are the vehicles that 1.5 billion people in China have access to. It has every single rear view mirrors with little screens built in and the display so you can touch stuff and choose whatever. You can get a new electric vehicle that is rated higher in quality and safety than any Tesla and costs, less than $8,000, because I was there in China and saw it. I went into a dealer and asked about their EVs, and that's the one they showed me. And it wasn't 300, it was like 270 miles equivalent, something like that. But that farther than the Roadster 15 years ago, it's not 500 miles, but there are also, what's really important here, a completely renovated energy system in China, and installing literally millions of EV chargers every year. So that if you do buy an electric vehicle, the infrastructure is there so that you can charge your vehicle and drive across the country without any issue. So not only is the US way behind in terms of manufacturing quality electric vehicles, but they're a century behind. They are an energy paradigm behind in terms of powering those vehicles and the electrical grid in general. Every year so far that China has been trying to renovate their electrical grid with large-scale battery storage called BESS, Battery Energy Stationary Storage, I think it is. Let me check. Electrical? Battery energy storage systems. So they're running off of battery power, pure electrical power, rather than coal-producing plants or fossil fuel-producing plants, so that the energy is just there. It's just always there. They make as much as they need, and then it will be available. You won't have to worry about the ebb and flow as much. And right now, coal plants, fossil fuel plants are powering some of those battery energy storage systems. But another key thing, well, let's talk about this statistic first. China is installing 25% of the world's battery energy storage systems. So if you have 200 countries, you would expect 50 of those countries to be making 25% of battery energy storage systems. But of course, countries are all different. China is installing 25% because that is going to give their citizens and the government a huge advantage technologically and culturally. They're going to look like the most advanced country in the world. And when you go to some cities in China, like Shenzhen, or I was going to say Beijing, but not really. But there are cities like Shenzhen when you land in China, and it's undeniably more futuristic than any city in the US is. It's not as fun or whatever, but there are electric cars everywhere. There are electric charging stations on every single street, autonomous delivery drones, driverless taxis. In terms of citizenry, and this plays into the next part about transportation, the charging stations are remarkable. There are charging stations throughout the entire country, which is as large as the US, the entire populated part of the country, the eastern 30% roughly. And so all you have to do is buy a $100 US electric scooter, And you can basically go across the entire country. You can go as far as you need to get to your job or whatever. So private vehicles, the need for a private vehicle is much more affordable and accessible, and you can use it to transport yourself to economic opportunities that a US citizen wouldn't be able to transport themselves to if they don't have if they can't afford a private vehicle. And sometimes in the US, gas stations are 100 miles apart or more. It's wild how inconvenient the energy system in the US is, until you realize that it's run by just a few monopolies, and then it makes perfect sense why it is not catering to the needs of the citizens, but rather the needs of the wallet of the few. But let's get back to the technological advantage that non-US countries have. So Taiwan, microchips way ahead. China, manufacturing way ahead. And now high technologies, the next generation technologies like sustainable energy, battery energy storage, China is way ahead. They're installing 4 times as much every year than the US is at least. But that's a lot, but that pales in comparison to the amount of renewable energy that China is installing every year. Again, there's 200 countries. China is installing every year, at the very least, 200%, twice as much as the entire rest of the world combined. One country installing more than twice as much solar energy as 199 countries. Or it might be more next year. That's what it was this year. Those battery energy grids that they're renovating their traditional energy grids with are now being largely powered by solar power. And that's just free. That's a one-time installation. There's some maintenance every decade, but they make all the solar panels in China also. So at extremely low price points that the US military and corporations don't even have access to, China is installing next generation energy technologies. There's also fusion that they're working on. They say they're getting close to cold fusion, but everybody says that forever. But in practical terms, China is installing free energy, solar energy, for their country more than all other 199 countries combined. That is shocking to the point of I barely even understand how much solar energy is being installed in China. That's crazy. So on average, they're installing 200 times almost the amount of solar energy that each other country, 200 times more each country is installing. And that's going straight into their most modern in the system world energy storage system, which are rapidly becoming batteries. Because if you have constant access to energy, with, I'm sure, a few hundred fossil fuel backup plants in case whatever happens, you are in a much more advantageous position. Oh, again, with new storage grids, the US storage grids are old and ailing and breaking down, and they are not being repaired or renovated. Texas is a great place to look at. Like every single winter, the grid fails and people freeze to death. And Texas isn't going to renovate or update their electrical system because the citizens don't have the power to make their government do that anymore. And the corporations don't want to because it will eat away at 0.5% of one annual budget. So instead, the US energy infrastructures are failing completely, and people are dying. US citizens are dying as a result, while China is installing at a breakneck pace, at an unbelievably prodigious rate, the next generation of technologies that will secure a nation's defense and overall security. If they keep installing solar energy at this pace, China's going to have practically unlimited energy. If they keep installing solar power and they're doing wind power now, they have balloon wind farms to capture the upper currents, stronger winds up there so that they can generate more electricity more efficiently. And batteries to store all of that energy. And any moment now, the next commercial battery revolution is going to take place. There are things that work that store energy more efficiently in smaller, more efficient technologies, different types of non-chemical batteries like the conventional ones we all know now. But as soon as that does happen, even if it's developed in the United States, it won't matter because the manufacturing capacity is all in China and other Asian countries. They are going, as soon as whatever one commercially work, it probably has been developed already and is viably commercial, but the US government is trying to figure out how they can get an advantage on it. I would if I was in the Department of Energy. But as soon as we figure out, it could be anything. It could be 10 times as efficient or 100 times as efficient, a battery technology. And they certainly have technologies that are non-commercially viable that are 100 times more efficient. So there's really no way to know where the next generation of batteries themselves are going to be at. We have a good idea. There are some that are going forward faster than others, but China makes all of those, and we have no production capacity back in the US. So between the two Trump administrations completely abolishing research and development, technological research and development in the United States, and prohibiting scientists not born in the United States from working or obtaining a visa or beginning a scientific career in the United States, added to the manufacturing and technological capacity of China, not to mention just the raw capital that they have, it's objectively incorrect to say that the US has any sort of technological advantage over non-first world countries, which begs the question, then is the US a first world country if it's so far behind, if it's merely at par with or far behind other countries in these technological fields? Why would we even colloquially refer to a country behind other countries as a first world country? Which is why I generally don't. I've lived in too many countries that are considered second or third world countries with enormous material advantages and civil advantages over so-called first world countries. And this really slides right into the third one, transportation. Transportation makes the US a third world country more than any other metric because it affects all other parts of a citizen's life, having been to so many countries. And seeing the lack of opportunities that US Americans have because of the lack of transportation relative to other countries, and I'm going to talk about China again because they have deliberately solved that problem. And again, bear in mind, I have no particular love for the government of China or any other country. I'm not huge on governments. They're all making mistakes, and especially China. Abolish term limits. I don't like Xi Jinping. There's plenty of problems I have with China. But just in terms of what's a first world country, second world, third world, the second and third world countries have advanced far beyond so-called first world countries, including the paragon of first world countries, the United States. That so-called first world country is behind in most fields of two second and third world countries. They're not behind in military spending, but that's about it. So let's talk about transportation. Transportation is not as exciting a field, I think, even as like battery energy storage for the grid or new renewable energies, which gives you functionally unlimited electricity and energy. But transportation is critical to the health, the opportunities available, and the citizen robustness, like the strength of the citizenry of a country. They need reliable transportation, reliable, affordable transportation, or you're not allowing your citizens to fully develop into, even in the US, what you would want, a mass-producing citizen, someone who makes a lot of money for the country or a lot of superior technology for the country. there could be a genius electrical engineer in Miami, and he cannot get to another city in the same state, let alone to a different state, because he doesn't have a private vehicle, and there are literally no public transportation options across the entire state of Florida. The cheapest he could do could be prohibitively expensive to a lot of people, especially if he doesn't have a guaranteed job. Let's pretend that he's in Miami and Florida a couple hundred miles away. He can get there somehow, but easy access to transportation, easy access to traveling across the country to get to different opportunities is crucial to allowing citizens to take advantage of those opportunities. If citizens can't get to where they would fit in the best, if a wildlife person is stuck in Arizona and can't get to the forests where they want to do research or they want to take care of the nation's forests, the nation's forests hurt for that because that person can't take care of them the way they would. If that data scientist in Miami cannot get to another city where his talents could be used and developed, the data industry of the US lacks his potential and his expertise. Transport is essential, and all countries that I have been to realize that. They know that their people have to be able to move through the country affordably, because if you don't, you're just stagnating. Your people are each living in a tiny pond that offers limited options. And you might get lucky. You might be born into the one city where your opportunity, your skills and talents can be developed and added and help develop your country further. But usually, most of people will not be that lucky. Most people will be trapped in a place different than what they're used to. The guy in New Mexico won't be going to MIT if he can't travel over there. Or if he can't afford the education, or if he can't afford the healthcare because he broke his leg so he can't move, and then he's in medical debt. These are real impediments that US citizens almost exclusively around the world have to navigate themselves individually. If you can't get to your job in the US, that is your problem, and there's no national system or national resources to help you get to that job. If you can't get to the internship, if you can't get to your research site, if you can't access a place, that is the individual US citizen's problems, and there's no national system in place to allow you to develop your potential or develop yourself at all. That's inconceivable in most of the rest of the world. And it's not because of the size of the country, and I'm going to go back to China for this, because China is almost the exact same size as the entire country of the US. They're very close to each other. They kind of battle and say who has more territory, but they're almost the exact same size. And in the US, you can't get from Miami to Orlando or Fort Lauderdale by public transportation because it doesn't exist. Whereas in China, in one decade, from 2008 to 2018, there's a great chart from 2008 to 2020, so 12 years, and that shows what developed. There was basically one high-speed rail and a bunch of slow trains across the entire country. And then 12 years later, China built about 35 to 40,000 miles of high-speed rail across their entire populated area of their country. Again, the 30% of the eastern part of China. So you can get from Boston to Fort Lauderdale in under 10 hours for, I don't know, $40 US maybe. And if you want to take it slow, then you can get there for $10. It's incredibly cheap and incredibly efficient, and they're running all the time, and you can get across the country. Anybody who, again, not a fan of the Chinese government civil rights policies, if you're lacking in social credit, they won't let you on the train. But that's not a lot of the people. There's still 1.5 billion people in China who can travel around the country at will, even if they're laborers, like just day laborers, menial workers. Some of those guys commute 100 miles a day and just take the 10-minute bullet train that goes 100 miles to their job in Beijing and then go back to Tianjin at the end of the day. There's so much opportunity to be had by moving around the country. There are phenomenons in China that are not in the United States because of, largely, I think, because of transportation. In China, you can look up the real estate prices online and find out the quality of life and the real estate prices. And look, unemployment's terrible in China. Like I talk about it all the time. It's like 1 in 5 people under 30 are unemployed or looking for a job. And so there's plenty of problems. But the opportunity, the transportation opportunity is there. And education and healthcare I'll talk about later. But just transportation, there's a phenomenon of like, I don't even know what to call it. Oh, homebuyer trends. So in the US, you'd have homebuyer trends in certain neighborhoods of a city, right? Oh, this neighborhood is gentrifying, prices are going up, but there's a cheap neighborhood over here that people didn't want to live in before. Let's start moving over there and buying houses in that suburban neighborhood until that gentrifies, and then we go to the next suburban neighborhood. The practical effects of those homebuyer trends may occur over decades in the US, but only a couple of years in China, specifically because of transportation availability. So in China, that happens too. Like I said, the unemployment is really high for young people, but the thing about China is their cities are so concentrated. Like New York has 8 million people and a high population density, but the population densities, like just the actual density of the cities, can be 3 times higher or more in a ton of Chinese cities. 18 cities in China have over 10 million people. Chongqing has like 30 million. Beijing has 20 million. There's a lot of people living in cities in China. The rural life that is popular in the US is not as popular in China. They like population centers more in that country. But what's interesting about having a working transportation infrastructure is that they can through social media, they share the local real estate prices with each other. And instead of moving to the cheaper neighborhood, they can search where has the schools they want for their kids or the schools they want to attend, supermarkets, good hospitals, enough job opportunity or space to establish their own business that they can live. That is the cheapest in the country. And because so many people are living in cities, if they can find a smaller town of 1 million people or 500,000 people, I've talked about this on other episodes, there are literally countless towns in China where you could rent a place for a few hundred US dollars a year, or you could buy a house for 10,000 US dollars or less. And that's certainly still the case in China, especially with the concentrated urban populations. So instead of, looking for those neighborhoods in each city that are cheaper, a lot of young people are taking all of their savings and buying a house in the spot they've all decided was the most advantageous and favorable to them. It's out of the way of other places, but because of transportation, people from all around the country can go to one city where the prices for houses are still, let's say, 5,000 US dollars, and they'll show up, buy a house, have their own individual house, and they can at least live life comfortably enough. They're not trapped in the urban race that does exist in China as well, and struggling to survive because it's cheaper out there, but they're still next to a hospital and they're still next to schools and there's nice parks and all that kind of stuff. And you'll see that this is happening all over China. And that won't happen in the US because the people that need those affordable housing areas the most usually don't have enough money to get over to the affordable housing. They can't access What takes homebuyer trends from people starting to move in to becoming a more active neighborhood with a bunch of families living there? What would take the US decades because of a lack of transportation. There's no easy way to get to a different part of a state or a country. Takes a state in China a couple of years, literally like 2 years, and you can have every vacant house in a place moved into. Someone put something up on TikTok, and then people in China see that there are $7,000 USD equivalent homes in this place, and they're looking for a home. They can take a train that day, it'll go there, and they can buy the house. There's no consideration of how far away it is if it has everything they're looking for. They know they can get there, and they do. Those solar panel installs, those are done by laborers who take trains to their job wherever it is. They know that they can jump on the train and get there. So they just get the job, go 100, 500, 1,000 miles, and start installing solar panels. In the US, getting a job 1,000 miles away would take a lot of logistical planning just to get over there. Not so in most so-called second and third world countries. They can't access the opportunities they can, of course, it's possible with private companies and all that kind of stuff. But it's so much more costly and so much more time intensive than in China. And that Florida example, or really any state without public transportation across the state, which is most states, if you want to get across the state, you have to hire either a private company, which is going to be expensive, or you have to have your own vehicle, which is going to be much more expensive and takes a lot of time to maintain and take care of and register and all that stuff. And if your vehicle breaks halfway, you are SOL. You're probably not going to make it there. Maybe you'll limp back home to where you were and be able to reestablish. But it's a difficult process just to move across your own state in the US. Whereas in China, even if you are very poor, even if you're one of those unemployed people in your city in China, if you have that $5,000 in savings that you're living off of, and there's a house for $5,000 that is literally 2,000 miles away, they can jump on a train or a bus at any hour, day or night. But there are so many trains now since that 12 years of rail expansion, 40,000 miles crisscrossing all of populated China, that when they choose a house, even if it's 2,000 miles away, they can take a train there for about $20 and are done. They made it there. You get on the train, maybe they'll transfer at a couple stations. You can take trains across the entire country, though. I took trains from Beijing, which is at but it's at the northeast of the country. And I took that 1,600 miles or something southwest to Hong Kong multiple times in China. And that was before this rail revolution that they've had while I was living in China. So now it's probably cheaper and more convenient to get around because there are so many trains all the time. And they run on time and they're affordable and they go everywhere in the populated part of the country. So yeah, if you have a university you want to go to, but it's all the way across the country, that's not a problem in China because you have access to affordable transportation there. If you want to move your family to a place with better schools and better hospitals, yep, and you have the means to buy a house there or whatever, you can get right over there. And in terms of having the ability to buy a house, you can find out what the real estate prices are anywhere in the country, and you can take a train either directly there or very close by and then take a rideshare or just ride a moped over there for another 30 minutes. Because the rail stations are really everywhere. That country is connected now. So anything that would be difficult for a US citizen or costly or time intensive in terms of travel, like in their own country to deal with, is not an issue in China anymore. It's completely eliminated as an issue. Transportation. You have access to it and it covers the entire populated area of the country. Now, I've mentioned education and healthcare, and transportation pays into education and healthcare quite a bit. If you have a procedure that needs to be done or some treatment, some very necessary critical treatment, in China, you can get a train, you can get transportation to anywhere in the country in a very short time individually if you're able to move yourself. But it's so much easier to access specific specialized medical care for your condition in China than it is in the US. What is the same about healthcare in China and the US? You can look up online where the specialists are for your condition. That's pretty much where the similarities end. In the US and China, you can look up where the specialists are for your condition and like where they're located relative to you. Now, in the US, it's probably going to be too expensive for you to pay for because the healthcare system is too expensive for most of the US population to pay for. In China, it's affordable. You can usually afford it. And there are more specialists every month in China. They have a robust medical training program. So when I was in China, even living there full time, maybe 7 years ago or something, I still wouldn't go to Chinese hospitals for everything. But I just visited last year, and like everything else they've poured money into and focused on improving, the hospitals look a lot nicer than when I was there before. And not just the main, the big hospitals, some of the rural hospitals and clinics have clearly been updated. And it seems like China is investing in the medical field, finally, the same way Thailand did and Colombia did and other countries did a long time ago. Because medical tourism is shooting up as a medical destination. China is shooting up among travelers. And I would not have recommended it before, but now it's so affordable. And in the recent years, there are so many positive reviews from medical tourists to China. Medical tourism shot up in China by 400% in the mid-2020s. When I was living there, the dentists used old technology, and now it's a decade later and they are using new technology. If I didn't see the rail system being built as rapidly as I had when I lived in China for 6 years plus, it would be difficult to wrap my head around this or really believe it. But while I was there, I arrived in China in 2012-ish. And while I was there for over those 6+ years, I saw new high-speed rails being developed every other month, connecting another part of the country to another part of the country. And by the time I left, the entire country was connected by rail. And when I arrived, maybe 30% of the country was covered by rail. And this is about 1,000 miles east to west and 1,600 miles north to south. And they completely connected that through public transportation in a decade. It's pretty wild. So it's not insane for me to go back 7 years later and see that all the clinics and all the hospitals look new, all the ones that looked old 7 years ago, because that makes sense with how fast, once they focus on something that already has resources, they can catch up very, very quickly. So transportation plays into this healthcare, because when you look up the specialist in the US, you probably can't get there and you probably can't afford the treatment. And both transportation more are just simply not an issue in China. There are still certain treatments that are more expensive than others, and if you were born into a very poor family or whatever circumstances of everybody, you might not be able to pay for the best treatment, but far more Chinese citizens can afford fundamental healthcare than US citizens can afford fundamental healthcare. Basics, essential emergency services, and standard procedures, far more Chinese citizens than US citizens can afford to go to hospitals and receive standard treatment. I've been to hospitals with friends in China, and I've also seen them receive fairly advanced treatment, and then reportedly on medical tourism websites, I've seen that they perform basically all medical procedures now. I just can't personally say, and there hasn't been enough time to say really how advanced the medical treatment is in China, But yeah, for most procedures, it seems like a good idea these days to go to China if that's the most convenient country outside of your own country for medical tourism. So these are huge differences that come about simply by having access to transportation. And the last one I want to mention is education, because the US education system is a huge problem, and also, in my mind, in addition to healthcare and transportation, automatically disqualifies it from being referred to as a first world country. Because Americans don't have access to higher education. It's difficult for them to move across the country, and if they can, they can't go back very easily to see their families on breaks, and if they need to do a research trip for their university, they can't get around the country easily. It's just very expensive, and it's very time intensive. It's extremely inconvenient to travel around the US. Now, as I've mentioned 100 times, very easy to do so and very affordable to do so in China. Education, though, I'm not just talking about higher education. There are so many children in the United States who don't have access to basic education because the school bus doesn't pick them up, they're too far away, or their parents don't have a vehicle so they can't drive them to school, and they're too far away to walk, and their parents can't take them to school because their parents have to go into work because the cost of living is so high in the US that they can't spare the 1 hour they need to get their kid to school on time so their kid is safe in school. Now, this is huge, like from kindergarten until university, that transportation problem is still a problem in the US, and children, not just adults for higher education, cannot access basic education. And if they can, it takes a long time to get there, and yeah, it can take an hour each way, and an hour, that's a lot of time taken out of that kid's life or the parent's life if they have to drive them for 40 minutes and back, out of both of their lives. It's just a very inconvenient system for one of the most fundamental education, for one of the most fundamental civil necessities of any country. But if you're living in most countries, including China, you can take the train for 10 minutes and go to a different city. They do have like Haikou or, I forgot what it's called, but it's basically like you can get your kid educated in this city and you get like a stamp, Haikou, maybe? I think that's maybe an island. But it's very easy to transport your kids to whatever school they have to go to, or your middle school or your high school or students, wherever you want them to go to and can get them into, they can get to that school anywhere in the country, every day on high-speed rail or public transport, efficient public transportation. That's not a reality in the US. So simply by having transportation, everyone has access to educational, housing, and healthcare. They don't make as much money in China on average, but it doesn't really matter because everything is affordable and matched to the amount of money everybody in China has. So if you're in the US and you don't have a lot of money, SOL, you don't get to participate in the US system that wealthier people get to participate in. You don't get healthcare, you don't get housing, and you don't get education. That's just how it works in the US. In China, regardless of your income level, obviously there's going to be outliers, but regardless of your income level in China, you can afford a level of education, a level of housing, a level of healthcare. Those are citizen-centered services, whereas in the US, they are profit-centered services, and so they don't serve the citizens, so fewer citizens have access to those social necessities. Now, I've been talking a lot about China just because it's a very good way. I like comparing China to the US because it's the exact same size country, has a very similar GDP. They have 5 times as many people in the country. So all of the problems that they have solved that the US is choosing not to solve, they've done so in a decade, basically, for each major problem for 5 times the amount of people. That's something to consider. And again, I'm not saying the ideology is better. I don't think Xi Jinping is a good president, and I don't think the government is particularly beneficent toward its citizens. But they do have access to basic civil services like education, transport, and healthcare that the U.S. citizens lack, that the U.S. citizens do not have access to or do not have affordable access to. They might live right next to an Amtrak station, but Amtrak is like 10 times the cost of any Chinese high-speed rail, and it's slower than any Chinese rail. So China is a useful comparison because they've solved all these problems with so many more in the same size country. But the thing is, I'm not just talking about China, which people I think are coming around to understanding is an advanced nation, in many ways more advanced than the US at this point. But these advantages that China enjoys that US citizens are completely bereft of, it's not just China. It's most of the world. Most of the world has healthcare, education, and transportation pegged to the average income or lower so that more citizens have access to basic civil services. Because it's statistically proven that if your citizenry is better informed, better educated, healthier, they will produce more for the country. Your country will get richer. Overall, that's fact. There's no disputing that anymore. That's how it works. If someone is healthier, they can produce more, and the country has a higher GDP. But those advantages are not unique to China because it's an advanced nation with a lot of resources. Cambodia, Laos, some of the poorest countries I've been to, anytime you need to get across the country, you can wave down a pickup truck, I guess a jeepney in English, and you pay a couple dollars and they will take you 100 miles. Literally $2 and you'll go 100 miles to the next city. Even that's a private guy who owns his truck. He puts in a couple seats and a roof covering the bed of the truck, and then it becomes a bus, and he takes you across the country. But the point of that is not to make the most profit possible off of a transportation service that this guy is offering. The legislation and the point of these private operators is to transport people for a reasonable fee that they collect. And it's such a stark difference from the profit motive of US American infrastructures, that you can have a country where the currencies, it's so... Thailand's a great one. Thailand. $1 is 30 Thai baht. And you can buy drinks and snacks for 5 Thai baht. So you can get a meal and drinks for $1 in many parts of Thailand, all over Thailand. But you can also pay that dollar and get 50 miles down the road to another city if that's where your opportunity / if that's where your healthcare / if that's where your education that you need to get to is. So even in countries, and Thailand's rich compared to Cambodia or Laos, even in those countries, there are transportation services that the normal citizenry can pay for and access any kind of opportunity they need to access because the transportation is there. That goes for healthcare and education as well. It's citizen-centered rather than profit-centered as the US infrastructures are. So when someone asks me, what are third world countries like? Or, but isn't Cambodia a third world country? I ask them, well, what is a third world country? And when they say, like poor, no matter how little money you have, if fixing a broken leg costs $40 instead of $4,000, people can afford the $40 to fix their broken leg. It's pegged to the income and capital of the citizens of the country, unlike, very uniquely, the US and a few other countries. so that most of the country, most US citizens, cannot afford basic civil services because it's not focused on the citizens. It's focused on extracting profit. And it's okay to use the term third world countries. It's inaccurate and anachronistic, but if you say it, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. I didn't realize that it was a largely political term that referred to a couple dozen countries out of the entire world. I thought it was some designation, something, but no, it's basically just a insult to the rest of the world, saying that we're the best first world countries and everyone else is whatever. But these days, if you're referring to a third world country, you're referring to a country that very likely has more beneficial civil services and a higher quality of life than the US, which most people think of as a first world country, but fails all of the metrics by which I would measure the progress of a country. Education, healthcare, transportation, quality of life, access to housing, all of these things, by how we measure the progress and value and prestige of a country, the US falls short in. When you look at the actual application of those services to its citizenry, a couple people can access them, but the vast majority of its citizens simply don't have access to services that so-called third world country citizens do have access to currently. You can't access higher education in the US. Most countries' citizens can. You can't access your healthcare because it's too prohibitively expensive or far away. Most citizens can in most countries. Looking at how US Americans define third world countries and how most people define first world countries, the US is not there. They never quite made it to first world country status. And especially with recent political events, they're falling further and further. The advancements that they claimed to have had before are now pretty far out of reach for both the US government and US citizens. And they are not the only country capable of improving lives and infrastructures if they choose to. China can definitely now improve any part. They've proven it over and over again. Renewable energy storage, battery grid storage, transportation, healthcare, education. They've improved all of those. So they can improve these infrastructures in the way that the US likes to pretend it is the only country that could improve situations and conditions so quickly if it chose to, which it repeatedly chooses not to. It doesn't make healthcare affordable to the country, even though it could. It doesn't solve homelessness, even though it could. It doesn't solve healthcare, even though it could. And there's no real public transportation, national public transportation infrastructure available to the country. And that gap will just keep widening until the US invests in first world infrastructures and first world citizen services. China's going to pull ahead. Thailand has pulled far ahead in the medical field. You can get services in Thailand that are ranked higher in quality of care, medical equipment, medical expertise than the US as country healthcare infrastructures. And the procedures in Thailand cost less than 20%, sometimes less than 10% of the cost of US medical procedures. And they're better. That's wild. Thailand's pulling ahead in medical. Taiwan already blew past the US 20 years ago in terms of next generation microchip production. China blew past the US in terms of renewable energy, electric vehicles, battery grid storage, transportation. I don't think healthcare yet, personally, just having been there 10 years ago, but I wouldn't be surprised if in another 10 years they blew past the US in healthcare affordability and accessibility and quality of care. Education, accessibility, and affordability. So it's okay to make a mistake and say those third world countries. I want people to bear in mind that many of the countries you think of when you think of a third world country offer better citizen services and quality of life than the US does as a prime example of a first world country. It's important to keep in mind that the way we think about the rest of the world is not reflective of how the rest of the world actually functions. And I'm sure many of my episodes are about this, but I keep running into this again and again, and each time I stop by in the States, something else makes itself known. I realize that people are asking me about third world countries. I realize that US Americans are asking me about third world countries, and they don't understand that they're living in the most advanced third world country in the world. They don't know that people in Laos can get across the country. That's never been a concern for anybody who lives in a country with a GDP insignificant compared to the US. But they've never had to worry about transportation to a part of their country limiting their opportunity. No one in Laos has. Or Guatemala, or Colombia, or most countries in the world. That's just not something most people in the world worry about. They're like, well, then I get on the bus and I go to that part of the country, which people in the US can't say. In the US, they say, don't go on the Greyhound. Someone will cut your head off. And I mean, that does happen occasionally in the US. But this isn't meant to be a punitive podcast or meant to make anyone feel bad. I've answered this question in all of these ways individually. If I'm talking to one person, I'm usually just giving them one of these examples until it turns around. But this is a podcast about rambling, so I'm rambling. I'm just talking about all of it. I'm very glad I got this off my chest. I've been thinking about it a lot lately because I was talking to someone in the US and they started asking questions the last time I was there, and I had to explain all of these because I had to show them the map of Chinese high rail infrastructure. They built them in a decade. And then I had to explain about housing costs and show them screenshots. My friends talked to them from China, and I had to explain a lot of this to them. And we talked for 90 minutes. We talked for about this podcast episode, and they kept asking questions about like, well, what do they do for health insurance? And I was like, that's national. You're covered by it if you are Chinese. So by the end of it, they said to me, so am I living in a third world country? Is the US a third world country? And I answered that according to the standards we're talking about for first world versus third world countries, yes. US citizens don't have access to the higher quality of life that people in most countries can expect. But that's just the colloquial term. We probably shouldn't even use that term. But by the way we're talking about, by the way you mean third world countries, yes. US citizens don't have the quality of life or reasonable civil liberties that other so-called third world countries do enjoy. And it kind of shook them. And they were quiet for a moment and just sat back and thought about it. And now they know a little bit more. And honestly, after it was over, I was like, we should have waited so I could record this. But next time I go to the States, I'm sure someone will ask me the same question, so maybe I can record that conversation. And I like talking to people, and they didn't feel bad I wasn't attacking that person. I was just explaining when they told me like, yeah, but the third world countries have it really bad. And I have to explain to them that they're living in outside of the countries that are active war zones or have like genocide actively going on. They're living in about the third worldiest type of country there is. Thank you very much for listening. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I'm glad I got it on tape, as they say, in the biz. You can talk to me at bitofarambler@gmail.com or bitofarambler on Lemmy and Blue Sky. Thank you again. I will talk to you soon.